There is a passenger jet sitting somewhere on this planet right now. Not in the sky, not in a hangar, not on any runway. A 200-foot Boeing 777 carrying 239 human beings that took off from a major international airport in the middle of the night and simply stopped existing. No wreckage field, no mayday call, no black box signal, no explanation that every government, every aviation authority, and every search team on Earth can agree on. For more than a decade, the most technologically monitored species in the history of the planet, a species that can photograph a comet from 400 million miles away, has not been able to find an airplane. This is not a story about a crash. Crashes leave evidence. This is a story about an absence, a hole in the record where an airplane used to be. And the deeper you go into what actually happened aboard Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, the less this feels like an accident, and the more it feels like something that was never supposed to be found. This is the full story of the plane that disappeared for over 10 years, the search that became the largest and most expensive in aviation history, and the mystery that, even now, refuses to close. Stay until the end, because the final chapter of this story is happening right now, in 2026, on the floor of the southern Indian Ocean, where a ship is still looking. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you remember the day this story broke. This flight touched almost every country on Earth, and we want to see how far it reaches again. The last normal night. The 7th of March, 2014. Kuala Lumpur International Airport, Malaysia. It is just after midnight, and Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 is a routine red-eye. This is not a dramatic flight. It is the kind of flight that happens thousands of times a day, all over the world. A scheduled overnight hop from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, roughly 2,700 miles, a flight time of just under 6 hours. The aircraft is a Boeing 777-200ER, registration 9M, MRO, a twin-engine widebody powered by Rolls-Royce Trent 892 engines, one of the most reliable long-haul aircraft ever built. This specific airframe had flown for more than 53,000 hours without a single major incident. On board are 227 passengers and 12 crew, 239 people in total, representing 14 nationalities. Most are Chinese nationals traveling home. 2 are Iranian men later confirmed to be traveling on stolen passports, a detail that would fuel early terrorism speculation before investigators ruled them out as economic migrants with no connection to extremism. In command is Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53 years old, one of the most senior and experienced pilots at Malaysia Airlines, with over 18,000 flight hours. Beside him is First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid, 27, on one of his final training flights, before being certified to fly the 777 without supervision, at 12:41 a.m. The local time, the aircraft lifts off from runway 32R. Nothing about the takeoff is unusual. The aircraft climbs to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Everything is normal. And then, 40 minutes later, everything stops being normal, all at once. Before the turn, before the satellite handshakes, before any of this became a mystery, Flight 370 was 239 individual lives, each one boarding a routine overnight flight, with no reason to think it would be their last. Of the 227 passengers, 153 were Chinese nationals, many of them artists, students, and business people, returning home or traveling for work, including a delegation of Chinese calligraphers and painters who had just completed a cultural exchange exhibition in Kuala Lumpur. There were 38 Malaysians on board, among them the 12 crew members. There were passengers from Australia, Indonesia, India, France, the United States, New Zealand, Ukraine, Canada, Russia, Taiwan, and the Netherlands. Among them was a young couple who had just gotten married. A group of Malaysian semiconductor engineers were also aboard, a detail that briefly, and ultimately without foundation, fueled early speculation about industrial espionage. Two of the passengers were Iranian nationals in their late 20s, traveling on stolen Austrian and Italian passports, purchased in Thailand under false identities. Interpol confirmed within days that both passports had been listed in its stolen document database for years. Yet no immigration checkpoint in the region had cross-referenced them before the men boarded. Investigators from multiple countries, including the FBI, spent months examining their backgrounds and ultimately concluded they were almost certainly undocumented migrants attempting to reach Europe through Amsterdam, not hijackers. Every one of these 239 people boarded, believing they were on a 6-hour flight to Beijing. None of them, according to every available piece of cockpit and communications data, appears to have known otherwise until it was already far too late to matter. 40 minutes. At 1:19 a.m., as Flight 370 is about to exit Malaysian Air Traffic Control airspace and enter Vietnamese airspace over the South China Sea, Air Traffic Control radios the aircraft with a routine handoff instruction. The final voice transmission ever recorded from the cockpit comes back a few seconds later. Just 5 words. "Good night, Malaysian 370. According to the official investigation, the voice was calm. Nothing in the tone suggested distress, an emergency, or coercion. 2 minutes later, at 1:21 a.m., the aircraft's transponder, the device that broadcasts the plane's identity, altitude, and position to air traffic control radar, stops transmitting. This is the exact moment Flight 370 disappears from civilian radar screens. To the controllers watching, the aircraft simply blinks out of existence between Malaysia and Vietnam. But it did not stop flying. According to data later recovered from Malaysian military radar, released under intense pressure from investigators and the victims' families, the aircraft did something that no mechanical failure explains. It turned, sharply. It banked off its planned route to Beijing and began flying back across the Malaysian peninsula, roughly retracing its own path, before turning again to the northwest and climbing to and descending from altitudes as high as 45,000 feet above the certified operational ceiling of the aircraft and as low as roughly 23,000 feet, according to radar data cited in the official Malaysian investigation report. It then flew up the Strait of Malacca and out over the Andaman Sea, tracked by military radar until 2:22 a.m., when it passed beyond the range of Malaysian coverage and vanished from radar entirely. For hours, nobody outside a small circle of military radar operators knew any of this had happened. The commercial world still believed Flight 370 was somewhere over the South China Sea, on schedule, on its way to Beijing. It was already gone. And the last conscious act performed by whoever was at the controls was not a distress call. It was a turn. The handshake? Here is where the story stops being an aviation mystery and becomes something closer to forensic detective work performed at a distance of thousands of miles, using a piece of equipment nobody had ever needed before. Even after the transponder went dark and the aircraft vanished from radar, one system kept functioning. The Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, known as ACARS, was disabled sometime around 1:07 to 1:37 a.m. Investigators were never able to pin down the exact moment, only that the system stopped sending its scheduled data reports. But a separate, more primitive piece of equipment kept working. The Satellite Data Unit, a component that maintains a background connection with an Inmarsat communications satellite in geostationary orbit, roughly 22,000 miles above the Indian Ocean, continued responding to routine, automated hourly pings, what engineers call a handshake, even though no actual data was being transmitted. Nobody at Inmarsat, a British satellite telecommunications company, expected these pings to matter. They are essentially a system checking that a phone line is still connected, without anyone actually talking on it. But mathematicians and engineers at Inmarsat, working with the UK's Air Accidents Investigation Branch, realized that the precise angle at which each of these 7 handshake pings arrived at the satellite could be used to calculate the distance between the aircraft and the satellite at that moment, using a measurement called the burst timing offset, alongside a Doppler frequency shift analysis known as the burst frequency offset. According to the Australian Transport Safety Bureau's official reconstruction, published in 2014, this data produced a series of concentric arcs across the globe, representing the aircraft's possible position at each ping. The final ping, received at 8:19 a.m., roughly 7 hours and 31 minutes after takeoff, placed the aircraft along a curve of possible locations stretching from Kazakhstan in the north to the empty waters of the southern Indian Ocean in the south. What investigators came to call the 7th arc. Using the direction and rate of the frequency shift, analysts determined the aircraft had turned south, not north, ruling out a landing anywhere in Central Asia. Combined with fuel calculations based on the aircraft's known fuel load at takeoff, this data placed Flight 370's final position, somewhere along a stretch of the 7th arc, roughly 1,500 miles off the western coast of Australia, one of the most remote, most inaccessible stretches of ocean on the planet. An airplane had been found not by radar, not by witnesses, not by wreckage. It had been found through mathematics, by engineers analyzing the angle of a satellite's routine handshake with a machine nobody could see. What makes this piece of forensic work extraordinary is that Inmarsat's satellite communication system was never designed for tracking at all. It existed to relay data and occasional text messages between aircraft and ground stations, a background utility nobody expected to matter in an investigation. According to the technical paper later published jointly by Inmarsat and the UK Air Accidents Investigation Branch, no aircraft accident investigation had ever before relied on this kind of handshake analysis to reconstruct a flight path, which meant investigators were, in effect, inventing a new forensic discipline in real time. Under enormous public pressure, with 239 lives and the reputations of multiple governments riding on getting the mathematics right. And what that math revealed was almost worse than not knowing. The aircraft hadn't crashed somewhere convenient, somewhere near a coastline or a shipping lane. It had flown for more than 7 hours after vanishing, deliberately or otherwise, toward one of the emptiest quarters of ocean on the entire planet, a region so remote that the nearest useful search base, the Australian city of Perth, was still more than 1,500 miles away. The search begins. The initial search, launched within hours of the aircraft's disappearance, looked in entirely the wrong place, because for days, nobody knew the Inmarsat data existed or what it meant. Ships and aircraft from Malaysia, Vietnam, China, and a dozen other nations converged on the South China Sea. The last place Flight 370 had been seen on civilian radar. It took nearly a week of political pressure, technical analysis, and public confusion before Malaysian authorities formally acknowledged, on March 15th, that military radar showed the aircraft had turned back and flown west, and that the search zone was fundamentally wrong. When the Inmarsat analysis was finalized in late March, the search shifted entirely from the South China Sea, roughly 2,000 miles across the Malay Peninsula, to the remote southern Indian Ocean. What followed became, according to the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, the largest and most expensive search in aviation history. Led by Australia, with support from Malaysia and China, the underwater search phase alone ran from October 2014 to January 2017, scanning approximately 120,000 square kilometers of seafloor, using towed sonar arrays and autonomous underwater vehicles across some of the most remote and hostile ocean terrain on the planet underwater mountain, ranges, volcanic ridges, and trenches plunging more than 19,000 feet in an area so far from land that support ships required weeks of fuel and supplies just to remain on station. The bill for that phase alone exceeded $150 million. It found nothing, not a wing, not a seat cushion, not a single confirmed fragment. In January 2017, the joint search was formally suspended. A privately funded search by the American company Ocean Infinity resumed in early 2018, scanning an additional 112,000 square kilometers, using a fleet of autonomous underwater drones capable of operating far deeper and faster than previous equipment. It too came up empty and was suspended in May 2018. Combined, these searches covered roughly 120,000 square miles of ocean floor, an area larger than the entire country of the United Kingdom, and mapped terrain no human had ever seen, revealing underwater volcanoes and canyons in stunning detail. The bathymetric data alone, collected almost as a byproduct of the hunt for wreckage, gave oceanographers their first detailed look at seafloor features in this part of the Indian Ocean, including a previously uncharted volcano, roughly the height of a two-story building, rising from an otherwise flat, abyssal plain. Search vessels operated in conditions that pushed both crews and equipment to their limits. According to reports from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, towed sonar arrays were dragged within a few hundred meters of the seafloor at depths exceeding 19,000 feet, in water pressure roughly 600 times greater than at the surface, through a region prone to sudden storms, 6-meter swells, and currents strong enough to drag search equipment off course. Multiple times, expensive sonar equipment was lost or damaged and had to be replaced or repaired mid-mission, adding months and millions of dollars to a search that was already, by any measure, the most expensive in the history of civil aviation. And somewhere, within or beyond that mapped area, according to every mathematical model built from the satellite data, is the wreckage of a Boeing 777. It has never been found. What washed ashore? For more than a year after the disappearance, there was not one single confirmed piece of physical evidence that Flight 370 had ever entered the ocean. Then, on the 29th of July, 2015, a piece of curved aircraft debris, almost 6 feet long, washed up on the beach of Réunion Island, a French territory in the Indian Ocean, roughly 2,300 miles west of the presumed crash site. French investigators confirmed it was a flaperon, a moving control surface from the trailing edge of a wing, and, critically, that its part number matched components used only on the Boeing 777. It was the first physical confirmation, 16 months after the disappearance, that the aircraft had entered the water. Over the following 2 years, more than 30 additional pieces of debris were recovered from beaches across the western Indian Ocean, Mozambique, South Africa, Mauritius, Rodrigues Island, Tanzania. Each one carried thousands of miles by ocean currents from the presumed crash zone. According to drift modeling conducted by the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation in Australia, the pattern and timing of where this debris washed ashore was consistent with a crash location along the 7th arc, lending strong scientific support to the satellite data. Among the confirmed pieces, a section of wing flap, part of an engine cowling bearing a Rolls-Royce logo, an interior panel, and a fragment believed to be part of a horizontal stabilizer. Of the more than 30 fragments examined, 3 were formally confirmed as certainly or almost certainly originating from 9M MRO, with several others assessed as highly likely. Every single confirmed piece was consistent with a violent impact with the ocean surface. Forensic engineers, who examined the flaperon in a French military laboratory outside Toulouse, noted damage patterns and barnacle growth, consistent with the part having separated from the aircraft on or near the water. rather than the aircraft having glided down intact in a controlled ditching. And yet, in more than a decade of searching, not one piece of debris containing meaningful human remains, personal effects, or flight data recorder components has ever been recovered. The ocean returned just enough of the aircraft to prove it was real, and kept everything else. What this changed? A single missing airplane forced the global aviation industry to confront an assumption almost no one had ever questioned out loud: that a modern commercial jet, once it left radar coverage over open ocean, could simply cease to be trackable at all. Before March 2014, this was not considered a crisis. Radar coverage has never extended across the open ocean, and airlines relied on periodic position reports rather than continuous tracking once a flight crossed into remote airspace. Flight 370 turned that gap in coverage into a 239-person catastrophe with no resolution, and international regulators moved unusually fast by the standards of an industry that typically takes years to change anything. In 2016, the International Civil Aviation Organization formally adopted new global standards, requiring airlines to track aircraft position at least once every 15 minutes during normal flight. A system known as the Global Aeronautical Distress and Safety System, or GADS. A further requirement, phased in through the following years, mandated that in the event of a distress situation, aircraft must automatically begin transmitting position data at least once per minute. Boeing and Airbus began incorporating extended-duration underwater locator beacons into new aircraft, capable of transmitting for 90 days instead of the previous standard of 30. Specifically because investigators searching for Flight 370's black boxes had run out of beacon battery life long before they had narrowed the search area enough to listen for it. None of these changes brought back the 239 people aboard Flight 370. But they exist, quietly, on every long-haul commercial flight departing today. Because in 2014, an airplane proved that the assumption everyone had made about global tracking was wrong. If you're still with us, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because what comes next is the part of this story that investigators have spent 10 years trying not to say out loud. The simulator. In the weeks after the disappearance, Malaysian police searched the Kuala Lumpur home of Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and seized a personal flight simulator he had built himself, running commercially available flight simulation software on a home computer setup. It sat largely unexamined by the public for 2 years. Then, in 2016, following renewed pressure from independent investigators and journalists, the Malaysian government released a portion of the FBI's forensic analysis of the simulator's hard drive. According to that analysis, data recovered from deleted files showed that on February 2, 2014, 5 weeks before the flight vanished, someone had used the simulator to plot a flight path departing from Kuala Lumpur, flying north up the Strait of Malacca, and terminating with a controlled descent into the fuel-exhausted, remote waters of the southern Indian Ocean, a route strikingly similar to the one investigators believe Flight 370 actually flew. Malaysian officials initially downplayed the significance of this finding, stating there was no evidence linking the simulator data directly to the actual flight, and noting that pilots routinely practice a wide variety of flight paths. But independent aviation investigators, including members of the international team that examined the wreckage debris, have described the coincidence as extraordinarily difficult to dismiss. No conclusive motive was ever established. Zahari's family and colleagues uniformly described him as a devoted father, a skilled and passionate aviator, and someone who showed no outward signs of the kind of crisis that typically precedes a murder-suicide. There was no financial collapse, no documented mental health crisis on record, no note. What existed instead was a private simulation, run alone, 5 weeks before 239 people boarded his aircraft, tracing a path into the same empty ocean where the plane is now believed to rest. According to the FBI analysis released by Malaysian authorities, The recovered data was fragmentary deleted files, reconstructed from unallocated space on the hard drive, showing coordinates and waypoints rather than a complete, continuous flight log. This fragmentary nature is precisely why the finding remains so contested. Skeptics, including some members of the original Malaysian investigation team, argue that home flight simulators are used by aviation enthusiasts to plot thousands of hypothetical routes for entertainment, and that isolating one route out of potentially hundreds and treating it as a confession is statistically unsound without knowing how many other routes existed on the same drive. Those who find the simulator data compelling counter that this particular route was not a common training exercise, not a route Zahari would ever have flown commercially, and terminated in a controlled fuel exhaustion scenario, in one of the only regions on Earth consistent with where the satellite data eventually placed the real aircraft, a level of specific overlap that, they argue, strains the boundaries of coincidence. Investigators have never been able to prove this constitutes intent. They have also never been able to explain it away. The competing explanations. Because no wreckage, no flight data recorder, and no cockpit voice recorder has ever been recovered, no official body has ever been able to issue a definitive cause. The most comprehensive investigation, Malaysia's 495-page Safety Investigation Report, released in July 2018, formally concluded that the team was unable to determine the real cause for the disappearance. What exists instead is a set of competing theories, each grounded in part of the available evidence, none of them able to account for all of it. The first is deliberate pilot action, that someone in the cockpit intentionally depressurized the aircraft, incapacitating everyone else on board, and flew it, alone and conscious, for more than 7 hours to a remote stretch of ocean, specifically chosen because a Boeing 777 would sink into water more than 13,000 feet deep, in one of the most difficult search zones on the planet, and never be found. This theory accounts for the sharp, deliberate turns, the transponder being switched off, the simulator data, and the aircraft's final descent into the most remote possible search area. It does not fully explain the altitude excursions recorded on military radar, and it has never been supported by a confirmed motive. The second is a catastrophic in-flight fire or mechanical failure, similar to incidents involving overheating lithium-ion batteries in cargo holds, which the 777 was in fact carrying that night in its manifest, alongside a shipment of mangosteens. This theory would explain a loss of communication systems and erratic altitude changes, as a crew struggling with a failing aircraft. It struggles to explain the precision of the turns and the aircraft's apparent continued controlled flight for more than 7 hours after the emergency should have already destroyed it. The third is a hypoxia event, a slow, undetected loss of cabin pressure that gradually incapacitated the crew and passengers over the course of the flight, while the aircraft, on autopilot, continued flying on a course already set before consciousness was lost, until it ran out of fuel and crashed uncontrolled. This scenario has a real-world precedent: Helios Airways, Flight 522, which depressurized in 2005 and flew on autopilot for hours over Greece with an unconscious crew, until fuel exhaustion caused it to crash. Proponents of this theory point to the aircraft's descent pattern as consistent with an unpiloted, fuel-exhausted final plunge, rather than a controlled ditching. Critics note it does not explain who deliberately reprogrammed the aircraft's course and disabled its communication systems in the first place. A fourth category, hijacking, military shootdown, or a landing at a hidden airstrip, circulated widely in the early weeks of the disappearance and has never fully disappeared from public conversation, in part because the total absence of an official explanation leaves an enormous vacuum for speculation to fill. Some versions of this theory propose that the aircraft was covertly diverted and landed intact somewhere in Central Asia. Others suggested a U.S. or Allied military installation on the British-controlled island of Diego Garcia, roughly 2,000 miles southwest of the last radar contact, played some undisclosed role. According to the overwhelming consensus of the international aviation and satellite engineering community, these scenarios have been effectively ruled out by three independent lines of evidence that all agree with one another. The physical debris recovered across the Western Indian Ocean, the satellite arc data showing continued flight for more than 7 hours, and drift modeling that consistently and repeatedly points back to the same remote stretch of the southern Indian Ocean, rather than anywhere the aircraft could plausibly have landed. No hidden airstrip theory has ever produced a single piece of physical evidence. Every confirmed piece of physical evidence points to the ocean. Every one of these theories is grounded in real, documented evidence. None of them is grounded in all of it. That gap, the space between what the evidence proves and what it can never fully explain, is the reason this remains, more than a decade later, an open case. And it is worth sitting with how unusual that actually is. Aviation accident investigation is, as a discipline, extraordinarily good at producing answers. The vast majority of crashes are fully explained within a few years, sometimes within months, because the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder are, in nearly every case, physically recovered from the crash site. Flight 370 is one of the only major commercial aviation disasters in the modern satellite era in which neither recorder has ever been found, which means every theory on this list, no matter how well supported by circumstantial evidence, remains permanently unprovable without the one thing that could resolve it: the aircraft itself. We are past the halfway point of this story, and what's still ahead may be the strangest part of all, because the search for this aircraft did not end in 2018. It restarted twice, using technology nobody had when the plane disappeared. If this story has surprised you so far, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we cover mysteries like this every week. The independent investigators. While official search efforts stalled, a loose international network of engineers, physicists, and amateur analysts refused to let the case go cold, publishing independent research that has, at times, run ahead of governments. Among the most prominent is Richard Godfrey, a British aerospace engineer who, alongside physicist Dr. Robert Westphal and other collaborators, developed a novel tracking method using something called weak signal propagation reporter data, a global network, originally built by amateur radio operators, to test how radio signals travel around the planet. Their theory holds that a large aircraft flying through these radio signal paths subtly disturbs them in ways that can, in principle, be detected and used to reconstruct a flight path, even years after the fact. Using this method, Godfrey's team published a proposed crash coordinate in the southern Indian Ocean that they argued was more precise than any previous estimate. The methodology remains scientifically contested. A working paper published by the team in 2025 sought to formally address criticism from skeptical physicists and aviation researchers who question whether the technique can reliably detect an aircraft at all. But the WSPR analysis was compelling enough that it directly informed the coordinates of the newest official search effort, illustrating something remarkable about this case. More than a decade in, private citizens with laptops and public data are still actively shaping where governments look for a missing Boeing 777. The search resumes. In 2025, more than 11 years after Flight 370 vanished, the Malaysian government formally re-engaged Ocean Infinity under a renewed no-find, no-fee agreement. This time targeting a fresh 15,000 square kilometer zone along the southern portion of the 7th Arc, with a $70 million reward payable only upon a confirmed discovery of the wreckage. The search was conducted in 2 phases, a brief initial phase in late March 2025, followed by a longer campaign running from the 31st of December 2025 into January 2026. one code. Using Ocean Infinity's vessel Armada 8605 and a fleet of Hugin autonomous underwater vehicles capable of independently mapping the seafloor in high resolution without direct real-time human control, guided by daily progress reports shared with the families of the missing. Across both phases, the operation surveyed approximately 7,571 square kilometers of seabed. According to Malaysia's Air Accident Investigation Bureau, weather and sea conditions periodically disrupted operations throughout the campaign. On the 23rd of January, 2026, Ocean Infinity's vessel departed the search area. The company confirmed it had, since first engaging with the case in 2018, spent a combined 151 days at sea and mapped more than 140,000 square kilometers of the southern Indian Ocean floor. Once again, the wreckage was not found. Oliver Plunkett, the CEO of Ocean Infinity, described the challenge in blunt terms, stating that the scale of the search, both geographically and technologically, is almost impossible to comprehend, even with the most advanced equipment the company has ever deployed. And still, the case has not closed. In June 2026, the Malaysian cabinet formally approved a one-year extension of its agreement with Ocean Infinity, pushing the search window through to June 2027, to allow the company to complete its survey of a remaining, unsearched pocket of roughly 7,400 square kilometers within the target zone. Transport Minister Anthony Loke described the extension as a direct commitment to providing closure for the families of those still missing. For the relatives of the 239 people aboard Flight 370, the search has now outlasted childhoods. Lee Eryu, whose son was on board, told the BBC something that captures the entire unresolved weight of this case better than any technical report ever could. For years, I have been asking, what do you mean by lost contact? It seems to me that if you lose contact with someone, you should be able to reconnect with them. More than a decade later, no one has been able to reconnect. What a missing airplane actually means. Step back from the satellite arcs and the debris fragments and the search coordinates for a moment and consider what is actually strange about this story. We live in an age where a phone in your pocket can be tracked to within a few feet, almost anywhere on the surface of the Earth. Commercial shipping containers are tracked in real time across oceans. Wildlife biologists tag individual birds and follow their migration routes from space. And yet a 200-foot aircraft, carrying 239 people, some of the most sophisticated navigation and communication equipment ever built into a commercial jet, disappeared in 2014 and has still not been found in 2026. That is not a failure of effort. 3 separate search campaigns, run by different organizations across more than a decade, have combined to map an area of ocean floor larger than most European countries, revealing underwater terrain that had never once been seen by human eyes. It is a failure of scale, of physics, and of an ocean that is simply larger, deeper, and more indifferent than almost anything else on this planet. Flight 370 is not a ghost story. It is not a conspiracy about secret runways or vanishing planes folded into another dimension. Every credible strand of evidence, the radar, the satellite handshakes, the drift-matched debris, the simulator data points toward the same conclusion: a real airplane, flown by real human hands, that entered a real and specific stretch of ocean and has simply not yet been located within it. What makes this case different from every other aviation disaster in modern history is not what happened. It is that, for the first time in the era of satellites, radar, and global surveillance, the wreckage itself has refused to be found. Somewhere along that 7th arc, in water deep enough to hide a mountain range, an airplane is still sitting exactly where it came to rest more than a decade ago, waiting for a piece of technology precise enough, or a search vessel lucky enough, to finally cross directly over it. There is also something quietly humbling in what this case reveals about the ocean itself. The southern Indian Ocean, the specific stretch of water where investigators believe Flight 370 rests, is one of the least visited regions on the surface of the planet, more remote, in terms of ship traffic, than most of Antarctica. Fewer vessels pass through those waters in a given year than pass through a single medium-sized port in a single day. It is not hidden by conspiracy or classification. It is hidden by sheer distance, depth, and the simple fact that almost nothing about it has ever given humanity a reason to go there. Until an airplane full of people gave humanity the only reason that has ever mattered enough to try. Every autonomous underwater vehicle that has ever crossed that seafloor, every sonar image, every newly mapped underwater volcano exists because of a single missing aircraft. In a strange way, Flight 370 has taught us more about one of the emptiest places on Earth than a century of pure scientific curiosity ever did. This has been the full story of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, the 40 minutes that changed everything, the satellite handshake that rewrote the search, the flaperon that washed ashore 16 months later. The simulator data no one can fully explain, and the search that is, right now, still active, still funded, and still looking. Which part of this story do you find hardest to accept? The turn, the simulator, or the fact that in 2026, with everything we can track and see and map, we still haven't found the plane? Tell us in the comments. And if you made it all the way to the end of this one, you already know this channel is for you. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and we'll see you in the next one.